Hello, AP Worlders. Part 3, final part, changes in society. Alright, this time we're going to do fur and slavery. Alright, in the early modern era, furs joined silver, textiles, and spices as major items of global commerce. Similar to silver in commercial agriculture, furs also had an impact on the environment. The inclusion of North America and Siberia into the global economy, the demand for fur went way up. The world also went through what is known as the Little Ice Age, which also increased the demand for fur. The price increase in fur led to strong economic incentives for European traders. Like everything else, fur trade was highly competitive, and the French were the most prominent. The British and the Dutch were the French greatest rivals for furs in the Americas. Only a few Europeans directly trapped or hunted fur. They usually waited for the natives to bring the furs or skins. The Europeans paid for the furs with a variety of trade goods, including guns, blankets, metal, tools, and rum. In Europe, the fur raised the standard of living, but in the Americas, fur had a huge environmental impact. Beavers became almost extinct, and the loss of many wetland habitats. For the Native Americans, the fur trade had many benefits. The goods they received strengthened their relationship with neighboring peoples and enhanced their authority of the chiefs. It also protected them from extermination, enslavement, or displacement that was the fate of natives in Central and South America. But nothing protected them from the disease. Also, competition amongst the native societies became more intense as the economic stakes grew higher. The fur trade generated warfare beyond what was known there. Native Americans became dependent on European trade goods, and this demand by both natives and Europeans eroded the customary restraints that was natives' traditional hunting practices. So these are all ways that the Native Americans their societies were disrupted or changed. Besides for germs and guns, another destructive European import was alcohol. With no prior experience of alcohol, native societies were destroyed by the binge drinking and violence and promiscuity and addiction that followed with alcohol. It wasn't the fur trade that ruined the Native Americans. It was all that came with it. The disease, the dependence, the guns, the alcohol, and the European colonies. At the same time that the fur trade was going on in the Americas, there was also a fur trade in the Russian Empire. As you guys hopefully remember from before, Russia was expanding out into this area, into Siberia, and one of the main motives was to get this fur trade, why the Russians expanded. Here, Europeans paid for Russian furs with American gold and silver. Russia imposed a tax or tribute on the people. Where's my mouse? Here it is. They taxed the people that lived out here with the tax or tribute, and the people had to pay with animal skins. To enforce this, they often took hostages and threatened them with death as a possible outcome if their fur demands were not met. The consequences for native Siberian people were similar to those of Native Americans, as disease took its toll and indigenous people became dependent on Russian goods, and many fur-bearing mammals became depleted. So they kind of had the same results that they had in the Americas, these people out here in Siberia. Alright, then the last society that we had to talk about is Africa and the Atlantic slave trade. Between 1500 and 1866, the trade in human beings took an estimated 12.5 million people from Africa across the Atlantic in the infamous Middle Passage. This would be the Middle Passage on the way over. Alright, the thickness of the arrow shows where the majority of the slaves went. So you can see, really, not as many slaves came to North America as the other areas. Brazil was one of the largest, as well as the Caribbean. Within Africa itself, the commerce thoroughly disrupted some societies. It strengthened others and corrupted many. Elites often enriched themselves, while the slaves were victimized beyond imagination. Known as the African diaspora, which is the global spread of African people, they were injected into these new societies, and issues of race that endured to today came during this time period. Slavery existed before this in the early hunters and gatherers and agricultural societies and pastoral societies, but it was closely linked to warfare and capture, and it was nowhere near as large of a scale as this slavery was. The Mediterranean and Indian Ocean were the major arenas of this pre-Atlantic slave trade. The Mediterranean would receive slaves, so this Mediterranean region, they would receive slaves from the Trans-Sahara trade, and the Indian Ocean would receive slaves from, like you see here, from the East Coast trade cities. Slavery took different forms in these early times. The slaves were often assimilated into the societies of their owners, and they lost a sense of distinctive identity. In some places, children of slaves were free, and some slaves held prominent military and political status. Slaves worked with smaller numbers laboring compared to the large scale that came to the Americas. Slavery in Americas was distinctive in several ways. First, the number of slaves, right? The huge number of slaves that came to Americas. Second, American slaves were largely based on plantation agriculture, and they treated the slaves as a form of dehumanized property, lacking rights. Third, slavery was inherent across generations. So if you were born to slave parents, you were a slave as well. And fourth, slavery in America became widely associated with race. So how did it all start? It started in the Mediterranean world with sugar. Once the Crusades happened, Europeans learned about sugar from the Islamic dynasty. And after they learned about sugar, the Europeans got addicted to the sugar, and they started to establish their own sugar-producing plantations in the Mediterranean, and some off the coast of West Africa. Then they got a religious backing. In 1452, the Pope granted Spain and Portugal permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the non-believers and reduce them to slavery. Africans were chosen by default as the natives to fall into this non-believer slavery group. And there was a couple of reasons why the Africans were chosen. First, they were chosen because the Native Americans were dying from disease, and the Africans were already immune to these diseases. Second, most Europeans were Christian, so they were exempt from slavery. Third, indentured servitude, those were people who would agree to work for a fixed period, and in return, people would pay for their transportation to the Americas, their food, and their shelter. They were too expensive, and they were only temporary. So the Africans, they were already skilled farmers and immune to disease, and they weren't Christians, so they fit the criteria of being allowed to be slaves, according to the Pope. At first, Europeans tried to raid the coast of Africa to get slaves, but they quickly learned that Africans were more than prepared to fight them off. They also died. Europeans also died when they tried to enter the interior of Africa to get their own slaves. All right, they would die from the different tropical diseases that could be found in the interior of Africa. So the slave trade changed in its operation. And what happened was the Europeans would wait on the coast to purchase slaves from African merchants. The Europeans would give firearms to West Africa, and that firearms would increase the tribal rivalries, or the rivalry between the tribes, causing even more warfare in Africa. They also would exchange for the slaves textiles, metal goods, firearms, and gunpowder, tobacco, alcohol, and silver from the Americas. Slaves would be marched from the interior Africa to the coast. And once on the coast, they would be held in jail-like structures till the European ships would come to trade for them. Africans didn't consider this selling their own people. All right? Africa was divided into hundreds of separate small-scale and often rival communities. They had no concept of a joined African community. The vast majority of the slaves wound up in Brazil or the Caribbean, because the labor demands were more intense. All right, so making that sugar, producing the sugar, was way more labor intense. So that's why the mortality rate was so high. The Middle Passage, the trip across the Atlantic, that had a 14% mortality rate. And about 10% of the voyages would experience a major rebellion on the ships. Many would flee and join free communities of former slaves known as Maroon societies. And they would be located in like far off remote places, like usually like in the hills or mountains or things like that. There are a lot of consequences to this African slave trade. First, Africa didn't experience the population collapse that occurred in the Americas, but it certainly did slow Africa's growth. Second, it produced economic stagnation and social disruption in Africa. Third, the slave trade shaped moral corruption in Africa. Fourth, labor demands on women increased greatly, as the majority of the slaves taken would be male. So the women, being disproportionate in Africa, had greater demands on them. And fifth, some women would use the slave trade to exercise their power and accumulate wealth. Some of them would marry European traders and use that position to gain wealth for themselves. Alright, so that's it for this part 3. I'll see you guys in class.